My name is Juliana Nicolasian with the Oklahoma State University Library. Today is Thursday, August 4th, 2016. We're in Vinita, Oklahoma, interviewing Cheryl Lansdown as part of our Spotlighting Oklahoma Oral History project with a focus on the Glass House restaurant. Cheryl, thank you so much for being with us today.
You're welcome.
Well, let's begin by learning a little bit more about you. Could you tell me the year you were born and where you were born?
Sure. I was born in 1945 in Lawrence, Kansas. My father was foreman of an ammunition plant there, and we lived in a little place called Sunflower. We later moved to Oklahoma after the war, and my father established a business, a Phillips station, M&K Garage, and my mother was a school teacher, and I grew up in Vinita.
Okay. And so when you were growing up in Vinita, kind of tell me about the schools you attended.
Okay. First of all, my mother was a teacher, and at that period in time, I was 5. They needed teachers badly, and so they wanted her to teach 3rd grade at Welch. So I was unable to attend school because legally I wasn't of age. So the superintendent said, well, just bring Cheryl as a visitor and she can go through 1st grade as a visitor. So I did that, rode to school with Mother every day. And after the 1st grade, I came back to Vinita, and they decided I was ready to go into 2nd grade. So I went to Riverside, which is a little school in the northeast quadrant of Vinita, not too far from where we lived on Illinois Street. And I was able to walk to school every day, and I did that 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade. Then in the 5th grade, my mother was teaching at a little country school called Carcellowery, strange name, probably an Indian name. And I went there half of 5th grade and 6th grade, and then came into Vinita and did junior high and high school and graduated in 1962.
Okay. And during that time period, did your father always have the Phillips station?
He had the Phillips station until he decided to go into the business of building homes. And he built a lot of homes in Vinita. Mother continued to teach at Ketchum School for many, many years, and ended up her teaching career at Will Rogers here in Vinita.
So, we're here today to learn a little bit more about the Glass House, and I want you to share probably some of your earliest memories of the building. What do you recall?
First of all, I recall the turnpike going in because my 2 uncles were on the group that installed the big signs that went up on the turnpike. That was an exciting period of time because watching that road come into completion and the Glass House being built, it was rather an ominous thing. It later turned out to be so iconic because it's so unusual. But as a young child, probably in my junior high years, we would just watch it being built. The lady that ended up managing the Glass House was a dear friend of my mother's. As I was looking back on this, I thought, I don't recall applying for this waitress job. It just happened. And I'm sure at church one day, my mother said, Cheryl's 16, Annabelle, do you think you need her to work at the Glass House this summer? And I'm sure Annabelle said, sure, send her out. I don't recall ever going through an interview. I just went to work one morning. And that's a rather funny story I'll have to share real quickly. I was 16, only child, never had done anything but a little babysitting. And I had my uniform. Here again, I don't know how the uniform appeared at my house. And that little perky white cap that we had to pin onto our hair. So I went out to work early in the morning, like 7 o'clock. And I drove out. I had a car and I drove out to work. And we parked in a parking lot for employees and had to walk across another parking lot to get into the Glass House. So I appeared not having a clue what I was going to do. I knew I was going to be a waitress and that was about it. So Annabell Southern, who, like I mentioned, was a dear friend of Mother's, and previously she had been a public service employee that if you happened to buy an electric range, Annabell would come to your house and show you how to use it. All the little bells and whistles that it did. Very, very social great person to work with, full of personality. She was always available. She never was in her office. She was always out on the floor. She was a small stature lady, but very energetic and just always had a positive attitude about things. So I walk in, and it happens to be very busy. A lot of people eat breakfast at 7 o'clock in the morning. And she hands me a pad and a pencil and said, "This will be your table. Go out and take their order." And I said, "Okay, I'm 16. I can do anything." I go out and I get this couple, and they tell me what they want, the eggs and the bacon, and they tell me and I'm trying to write every single thing down. Well, I learned very quickly that people are extremely particular about the way they like their eggs cooked. And often I would not convey the message from the person ordering to my tablet to the person cooking. So at my break, I decided I didn't like doing this. And so we only had a phone that was available to employees kind of in a corner. So I went back to the phone during my break, and I called my mother and I said, "I don't like this, and people are being angry at me, and I don't want to work here anymore." And Mother said, "Meet me in the parking lot in 5 minutes." She didn't handle whininess very well. So I met in the parking lot and I said, "Mother, people are just mean to me. They're talking bad to me when their food isn't just right." And she said, "Well, honey, did Annabelle mention how to shorthand things and how to..." And I said, "No." And she said, "Give me that pad." So Mother quickly gave me a 5-minute lesson on how to take orders. I went back in and stayed 5 summers. I loved it. I loved my time out there. I met so many precious people that were traveling. They'd come in exhausted, and they were just glad to see a smiling face. So I ended up staying 5 summers.
Wow.
Loved it.
Well, describe your uniform for me.
Okay, my first uniform was a white kind of nylon. Food slid right off of it. This little apron, little white apron. And it was more fitted, kind of an A-line. And we just wore white tennis shoes and this little white hat thing. My best friend and I worked 3 summers together, and that made it really fun because it was just someone you knew. There were a lot of everyday employees that were there, but there were just a few of us that worked the summer help, and we ended up working about 2 months. But the uniform was very simple. The second uniform that I wore was over in the broiler room, or we always called it the steakhouse because it was kind of the expensive place to eat. If you wanted to go on a nice dinner, you went over there. But it was white with little buttons down the front, and we had this pinafore with kind of ruffles and a larger apron. And I don't recall a hat. We may have had a bow or something, but I don't recall a hat. But the apron was much larger, and the skirt much fuller, shirtwaist, just fitted, puffy sleeves. It's kind of the uniform, and I have pictures for you.
Wonderful. Well, describe the restaurant setup for me.
Okay, there was a snack bar, and there was a cafeteria line. On the south side, there was the cafeteria line and the breakfast room. The breakfast room, where I began working, was the room that could be modified to hold big groups. We ended up having both our junior and our senior before prom dinner out there in that room because they could modify the tables and hold big crowds. The other side of the glass house had the broiler room, the steakhouse, and it had booths down the side of it near the wall that had the walkway from one end to the other. There was a long walkway with the gift shop being at one end and a snack bar being at the other, at least during the period I was there. The whole glass house went through a number of relocations and renovations after I left, but this was the way it was when I began. So after the breakfast was finished serving, then the cafeteria opened and the steakhouse opened then later in the afternoon. My shift was like 2 to 10 once I got over there. And I was so happy to be over there because we made 60 cents an hour. That was our wage. But our tips, on a good day, we could make $20 in tips. And that's a lot of 25 and 50 cent tips.
Mm-hmm.
Rarely did you get a $5 tip. Rarely. And that had to be a really big group. if you got that. But that's kind of the layout of it. I didn't spend a lot of time any place other than where I was working. We didn't wander around a lot. We just kind of, did our job. And I was trying to remember the break room. I'm sure we must have had one, but I don't recall where we went for breaks. We had a short break, I'm sure, during our time. And once in a while, if we finished, if there wasn't a lot of people, we'd get to come home early. That was always fun, because 10 o'clock is late.
Describe the menu for me.
Of course, the breakfast menu is very standard. Over on the steakhouse, what I remember, and I'll have to tell you about this one thing as I thought back about it, they served a beautiful fruit salad, and I had never seen a fruit salad quite like that, with a whole bed of lettuce and half pears and half peaches and slices of just all kinds of fresh fruit. But the thing I remember being so impressed with, because we participated in this, was half a cantaloupe, and they put a scoop of vanilla, ice cream in the middle, chocolate syrup, and then we had a bottle of creme de menthe, a liqueur, and we used a catful of the peppermint, the mint, to pour over the top of the chocolate over the ice cream in this cantaloupe. That impressed me so much. First of all, because we got to prepare it if someone happened to order it. But as far as the general menu, I don't recall a lot about the type of steaks that we had, or the hamburgers or chicken. I don't recall specifics about that. Mm-hmm. I'd have to refresh my mind by seeing a menu. But I do remember that cantaloupe. That really impressed me for some reason.
Well, I guess I was wondering if there were any signature dishes that stand out, or signature desserts, or...
I'm sure there may have been, but I don't. I remember chocolate. There was a lot of chocolate, it seems like, that people enjoyed. I do remember on the cafeteria line when I worked it, we were allowed to pretty much have anything on the line that we wanted except the pecan pie. And I don't know why, I suppose it was maybe a little bit pricier than the other pies. But I remember one day, now keep in mind I'm 16 and I've not been out in the world too much. One of the guys working obviously really wanted a piece of pecan pie. So he picked up a piece and he said, "Oh look, there's a thumbprint in this one, it can't be served." And I remember thinking to myself, I can't believe he did that. He made a piece of pie flawed so that he could eat it. I would have never thought to do anything like that. That was completely unacceptable. But I didn't tell. I just swallowed it and went on.
Well, I think a theme we see with a lot of folks who worked during the time you did was the influence of Annabell Southern.
Oh.
Can you just tell us a little bit more about her and her management style?
Like I said, she and my mother were very close friends, went to church together. I'd known Annabelle all my life. I remember as a young girl, she got the very first microwave in Vinita at public service. And they had a glass front building that you could walk by, and there were displays of various electric appliances that were in vogue. The very best range, the very, very best refrigerator, the very best oven, and she had a microwave and positioned it in front of this glass window that you walked by. And she cooked cupcakes in this microwave. It was the very first time I had ever seen or ever heard of a microwave. And you could watch the cake rise through the little small glass window that she had. So I had known Annabelle. I was very active in 4-H. And so we used a lot of her resources for demonstrations that we did, for public speaking, this type of thing. So when the glass house was built and she took over as manager, I don't think they could have searched the world and found a lady that was more qualified, had a perfect personality for working with both tourists and employees. She was always in the middle of whatever we were doing. She was not one of those, she wasn't a micromanager, I don't mean that, but she was always available if we had a question or if we had a need. One really funny story, and I probably shouldn't even tell this, but I will. My parents and I always traveled a lot in the summer. I'd end up working 6 to 7 weeks at the glass house. Well, one summer, must have been about the 3rd summer I was out there, Mother and Dad decided to go up north and meet my aunt and leave me home. I was like 18, no problem. Well, I go to work, and of course I've got the saggy face because they've never gone on a trip without me, and I had to go to work, and they're off traveling. So Annabelle, about 10 o'clock, comes out on the floor. I was still working in the morning at this point. And she said, your mother just called, and they're coming to get you. She said, here's how the conversation went. I answered the phone, and Lucia says, hi, Annabelle, how you doing? And she said, fine. She said, what would you think about us taking Cheryl out for a short trip? And Annabelle said, well, I'm sure we can probably work that out. When did you plan to leave? And Mother said, oh, we left this morning and we're at Welch and we're turning around. We've decided to come back and get her. And Annabelle said, Lucille, I'm going to get you for this. So she came out and told me and said, go home and pack your bag. Your parents are coming back to get you. And just laughed about it. But she took everything in her stride. Nothing threw her off. She just was great with the temporary help. She was great with the full-time employees. She was always available. She always had a smile on her face. She just had a great, warm personality. And I'm sure the tourists loved her because she would circulate all the time. I remember one time a family came in. We got all kinds of tourists, and the majority of our patrons were tourists. And this little family came in and they went through the cafeteria, they looked at all the prices, and they had like 5 or 6 little children. And the father came up and said to me, do you think we could buy a loaf of bread? And I said, let me get my manager. So I went to get Annabelle, and she took care of them. I feel certain they left with a full tummy, but they just couldn't afford. The prices were high for some tourists, especially over in the broiler room. The cafeteria was very reasonable. And the snack bar was just snacky things, so you couldn't really get a meal there. And I'm not sure they realized they could pull off the turnpike. Vinita was just right there. But in those days, you kind of stayed on the turnpike if you were on it. You didn't get off that much. I have to tell you one quick story about, all the signs that are on the turnpike. You mentioned in your little questionnaire, what question were you asked the most? The question I was asked often, they'd be sitting at the table and I'd come by to get the order and they said, we have a question. I said, sure, what is it? What is it? What does the sign mean, do not drive into smoke? And I found very quickly that if I just said, if you see smoke, don't drive into it. Oh. For some reason, just turning it around made sense to them. But they lived in a part of the United States that didn't have prairie fires like we have here. I have a friend that was raised in the north, and she said, I didn't have a clue what that sign meant. And we still see signs that say don't drive into smoke. But by turning it around, they would go, oh, makes sense. That was the question I got probably the most. That and that feeling of there was a little bit of give in that floor when a heavy semi would go under. It was very gentle and very subtle, and we became very familiar with it quickly. But the tourists would sometimes, is it safe? Is this building safe? Oh, sure it is. Enjoy your meal, you're fine.
Do you recall any of your fellow employees?
I recall a few. Warren was one of them. P.A. Engel was a classmate of mine, and I hope you've gotten P.A. to come. I don't know if you managed to get touch of him or not, but he ended up working for the group that owned the restaurant chain that later took place at the Glass House. I remember Warren. I remember a sweet little lady that worked full-time that had a lot of children, a little black lady, little tiny things. She worked all the time. But as far as others, I don't recall any that stood out in my mind. Mm-hmm. Summer help is kind of different than full-time help. Mm-hmm. Often you're looked upon as, the second child. You're just there for a little while and then you go on with your life. I was like a bad penny. I just kept coming back every summer. It was just so easy to do. So, but as far as any that stand out, they revolve too, of course, the full-time employees.
Well, when you were not working at the Glass House, you graduated from high school, mm-hmm. What were you doing?
I went to junior college first at NEO, and I stayed there 2 years. And during my second year in November, President Kennedy was assassinated. And my future husband was honored with being in his funeral service and then stood guard at the grave. I was in NEO College, and Bob had gone to NEO before going in the Army and came back, and so in December, after the funeral, he was released from the Army, and there was a big article about Bob with the president of the college welcoming him back. And I saw that picture and I thought, I think I want to meet him. So I walked in the student union one day, and there he sat with two girls in a booth, and I just walked in and sat down beside him and said, "Hi, I'm Cheryl Martin, and you're Bob Lansdown, aren't you?" And he said, "Yes." Well, we ended up dating and became engaged about 2 months later, and then about 2 years later got married when we were both juniors and seniors at OSU. We later went there and graduated. And I graduated in the middle of the year, and Bob finished up in May, so I taught in the public school system of Stillwater. I had done my interning there, so I taught. My advisor was Dr. Lohman, and my classroom teacher was finishing her PhD. So these two women cut a hole in the top of my head and just poured knowledge in. I just had two of the most phenomenal teachers in the world, plus my mother. She was an educator as well. So I had a lot of help becoming a teacher. And then when we graduated, we came to Bartlesville, and Bob went to work at the museum, Will Rogers Museum, and then became director about 2 years later. And I taught in the public schools there. We had two sons that are now grown. One is an employee at OSU, a senior graphic designer, and the other son is the father of twin girls, and he and his family live in Castle Rock, Colorado, and he owns a software company. So we have a small family. Bob and I are both only children, so we rely on our cousins a lot.
And what year did you graduate from OSU?
1967.
Okay. Well, kind of going back to your summers at the Glass House, you know, we're talking about the early 1960s.
Yes.
Do you notice anything in terms of the time period, in terms of the customers, going through the turnpike, it being the 60s?
Oh, the people, the tourists were, for the most part, now you remember a few that were not happy, but the tourists were just so happy to be in a nice place with a smiling face after driving long miles. You know, it was just an unusual place to have a stop and to have a meal. And those windows were just massive. I don't know if I ever really got used to that scene of those windows and looking out at that traffic going under you. They always came from the north and went to the south. I mean, they went both ways, but I worked on the north, so I watched the traffic coming. It was a sensation that I don't think I ever became completely used to. It was like living in a treehouse when you worked up there. And we were fortunate enough, every afternoon the highway patrolmen would come by for their coffee break. And they always liked to sit in the very first booth. As you entered the door, there was a corner booth that could handle several guys. And we got to know those men just every day they were in. Wonderful, wonderful men that cared a lot about the safety of people. They were very approachable. They were always visiting with the tourists, answering questions. They were very adaptable to any situation. I never feared highway patrolmen after working those 5 summers. You know, it never bothered me when I got whirled, and I did a few times. Never got a ticket, haven't gotten one yet. But I know one time I was coming back from Bartlesville to Vinita, and a highway patrolman stopped me, and he said, "You're in a really big hurry." And I said, "Well, I mentioned a name of a friend, and he said, "Oh, you're going to be late. You better go on." You know, it's a hometown. Everybody knows everybody. But it was nice getting to know the highway patrolman that came in every day.
Now, we've read that there was one worker who would dress up in Native American apparel. Was that happening while you were there?
No, it was not. I don't recall that at all.
Okay.
That would have been interesting.
Okay. Inside the facility, Do you recall any displays or anything on the walls in particular?
I'm trying to imagine, it had a center walkway that went from the snack shop to the gift shop, just a long open hallway. And there were bathrooms at both ends of that hall. But the hall itself either had doors that opened, the cafeteria was exposed. You could see it when you walked by.
Mm-hmm.
But you had to walk in an entry to the broiler room, a big wide doorway. And I kind of remember the register being on the right as you walked in. And then the booths went down the side, tables over by the windows and tables in the middle. But I can't recall what was hanging in the, I presume there were pictures of Oklahoma.
Okay.
Something very tourist friendly, I would imagine. But I don't recall a lot of particulars about that.
Now, after you had taken order,
Mm-hmm.
what would you do with it?
You take the order back to the area where the window where the cooks were doing their thing. And of course it was back through a preparation area because we were involved in some of the preparation of the food. And then we would take our order, huge trays. Oh my goodness, that was the hardest part about the job. And you couldn't really, you weren't supposed to carry them like this. You were supposed to get them up. And I was worried about your hair getting close to it, but they were pretty good sized trays, and they were hard to manage, either with food or with empty dishes, because we most of the time bussed our own tables. But the food was prepared back in that east corner, and then we brought it out on the trays and served it, and then cleaned up afterwards. Now, after my home ec degree, I know it's a very good idea to have busboys to do that. A person serving should not pick up dirty dishes. That doesn't make sense. But back in the 60s, we did it.
Do you recall any large groups coming through where, you just thought, wow, felt?
I'm sure we had bus loads. We had to have had, but I don't recall them being overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
Here again, I was in ages I didn't realize you could be overwhelmed. At 16 and 17, you just do it. And Annabelle, here again, just had a calmness about her. I'm sure she was never rattled when a bus appeared.
Mm-hmm.
And there wouldn't be any forewarning. They would just appear. They would just drive in and appear.
In your time there, did you notice a lot of folks from Vinita visiting the glass house, or was it strictly tourist
I'd
traveling?
say 90% tourist. Very seldom did we see Vinita people, I personally. That always surprised me. But we had some really nice restaurants in Vinita. So unless you wanted to do something special, like a little birthday party or a special date, and it was expensive for kids in high school dating, so I didn't see a lot of my friends come out there and eat. But we did have prom dinners out there. But as far as the everyday traffic, it was the majority tourists for sure.
Well, let's talk about those prom dinners because I find that very interesting. So now this is Cheryl as a student.
I'm a junior in high school. I have a date. If you're in a formal, the last thing you want to do is park in the parking lot for town people. We drive to Big Cabin, get on the turnpike, and drive to the glass house because then you can park where all the tourists park, and you're right by the entrance into the glass house. So here we come in all of our paraphernalia, our dressed up, the guys have their suits on. And they had, one theme was, for the prom at least, one was Blue Hawaii. And the next year it was something like, it had a Japanese theme. Can't tell you exactly what the name of it was. But we paid for our dinner out there, and then all of us they had long tables set up. There was a head table for like the president of our class and his date. There was not a lot of entertainment. It seems like there was music in the background playing, which I'm sure was just piped music. And we had our meal, and then we left. When back, that time I think we came home through the Vinita exit. But you couldn't get on and get to the glass house at Vinita. You had to go to Big Cabin and get on because you couldn't get there. You couldn't go that direction at the Vinita entrance. So that was always kind of special to do that. So we did that 2 years, our junior and senior year both.
And I'm guessing that was a pretty common theme for Vinita schools at that time.
I presume it was. It was, number one, the only facility that could hold us. I had over 100 students in my graduating class.
Wow.
I was the youngest. 100, I want to say 105, around 100, let's say around 100. So, you know, a good majority of us went with a date, often within the class, often not. So it was a big crowd, but in the breakfast area on the cafeteria side is where we held the dinner. And we still had that nice glass view, you know, it was still there. But that room was more adaptable for big groups. So those are good memories from high school.
Well, you were talking a little bit about how you could eat off the buffet line.
Uh-huh.
Was there a go-to that you liked on that cafeteria line?
You know, I remember, I didn't work in the cafeteria line but that one summer. Then I was across the way, and I would come at 2. I must have eaten something in the evening. I don't remember eating a lot of meals out there, but I must have. When I worked in the morning, I'd have breakfast at home, and then I'd have lunch, a sandwich. You know, it was nothing exciting. I didn't choose anything particularly exciting. I was probably on a diet, you know. It seemed like most of my life, so probably a lot of salad. But I remember there were a lot of choices on the cafeteria line. I can't specifically tell you what they were, but there were a lot of choices, you know, to come through. That's kind of what I remember.
Did you have any interactions with the workers on the Conoco end?
No.
The service station attendants?
I seldom went to the gift shop. Seldom. You know, I went to work, I did my job, and I left and went back home. I've thought later, I wonder why I didn't spend more time in the gift shop, because I love to shop. But I think I probably was ready to go to work when I got there, and I was ready to leave when my shift was over. So I just didn't spend a lot of time in the gift shop or the snack shop. I just did my job.
How big was the gift shop?
Well, it was pretty good size because it was that far end. It was pretty good size. You walked around standing displays. There were stands of things as well as counters. I can't remember where the register was, but I do remember standing exhibits, postcards, you know, that type of thing. My son has since gotten me some really neat old postcards from the Glass House, which I'm sure you'll have more than an abundance of. Did Warren keep a scrapbook, I think someone mentioned?
I don't know, but we're interviewing him later today.
Great. He'll be a good one. He'll have a lot more specifics than I will. I'm just kind of general. You know, at 16, you know, things are not quite as impressed on your mind.
Well, you know, this was one of your first major jobs.
Absolutely.
What are some lessons that you take away from your time working in the Glass House?
Well, of course, my first was if you make a commitment, you stick with it. My mother said that in not so many words in the parking lot that first morning at my break. You made a commitment, you go back in, you finish your job, and then we'll talk. Annabell's style of managing was one that I have always held in high regard. The way that she trusted us to do what was right, but was always available if we made a mistake, you know, if we had a question. But she was an excellent choice as a first boss to have. I've really learned a lot from her. And of course my mother, you know, mother was always there to guide me. When you have an only child, you put a lot of focus on it. I know when I went to Stillwater, or to Bartlesville to teach, I had taught second grade in Stillwater. And I have an early childhood degree all the way up through high school home ec. I got a double major and 4 minors. I just got the whole thing while I was there. Well, they had a 5th grade opening, and I said, oh, I'd rather not teach 5th, I like 2nd. And he said, well, I have a 5th. This was in August. So I called Mother when I got home, and I said, I don't know if I'm going to be able to teach or not. They have a 5th grade opening, and I really want 2nd. She said, Cheryl Lansdown, any teacher worth their salt can teach any grade. You teach 5th grade for 2 weeks, and then we'll talk. I said, okay. So I called him back, and I said, I'll take it. Here again, there was not a big formal interview. You know, I met the superintendent after he hired me, and that was it. I stayed in 5th grade for several years. I loved it. Mother was always right. And Annabelle was always right. You know, they were two of a kind. They were that strong, driven women. Mother was the only one in her family and the first one to receive a degree. She taught school. Annabelle was like that. You know, those women were different than we see today often. They just had a drive that was instilled in them to succeed. I can't tell you the number of kids that Mother and Dad have taken to NEO and enrolled and gotten in school. If they wanted to go to school, Mother found a way to get them there. She found a way to get them in. So she and Annabelle both, maybe that's why I was attracted to Annabelle so much. They were a lot alike. They were very positive. They were very approachable. They had an opinion about everything and didn't offer it unless you asked. But they were happy to share their opinion with you if you asked it. And I often did. Often.
They sound like great role models.
They were great role models. Oh, definitely. We lost Mother in 03. It was hard. Annabelle passed later. Annabelle developed Alzheimer's, and that was very sad to see a woman of that grit, you know, to lose some of that. Still had that smile, still had that twinkle, that orneriness. You know, there's a twinkle in the eye. I learned to read eyes very quickly as a teacher. You know, give me about 5 minutes with a child and I can pretty much tell you what's going to happen. But they taught me a lot about people, just about getting along with people and understanding people and giving them a little bit of leeway, give them the benefit of the doubt. And I certainly use that theory a lot in teaching.
When's the last time you've been to the Glass House?
My husband and I went out there when they were doing this last renovation on it. It still has that same feel. You know, you still walk across those glass windows and see that traffic going by. It still has that same magical feeling that there just can't be many other places. I think we were very fortunate in Vinita to have a place like that. And it's iconic, you know, it's something that is completely unusual. Granted, there are a lot of restaurants that are higher, bigger, wider, but spanning a turnpike, probably not.
You know, you've lived in this area for quite some time. You know, when you look back on your time in Vinita, I know you're a Bartlesville resident now, but how has this area changed through the years?
Vinita as a community,
Yes.
Probably the loss of some of the businesses as far as manufacturing companies that employed larger numbers of people, and I think this is a common scenario of a lot of communities the size of Vinita. But the warmth, you know, when you walk in Clanton's, it's still the same. My dad's garage was just across the street from Clanton's, so I grew up seeing that Eat sign. My boys grew up thinking that was the name of the restaurant, Eat. That's what was out front on the big mark. You know, it had to be the name of it. But the town itself, the people are still, I'm surprised at a number of my classmates that have moved back to Vinita when they retired. One lived in the middle of the state down near Oklahoma City, worked for DHS. She has since retired back here. A friend of mine, my best friend that we worked together, her parents had a ranch here. She has retired back here and is now teaching. She's still teaching at Nowata. A number of people have moved back to this community. It's close to the lake. Well, we had a lake house. You know, we were 30 minutes away from the lake growing up. It's just a nice location. You're close enough to Tulsa to get there when you need to. You're close enough to Joplin. There's lots of places. But as far as the change the little community has gone through, I can certainly see a difference when we started losing some of the little plant. They weren't large, but they were large enough that they employed a good number of people. So I can see that as a change in the community. But the warmth that it has, it's still home. It'll always be home to me.
Has Route 66 always had an impact in the area?
Oh, I think so. That combined with Phillips 66, that combo is just made it a really special place. That and the fact that two major railroads cross in this little town, that doesn't happen frequently. So even though it's often a headache if you're going north, south, east, or west, only if you're going one of those four directions does it really bother you. But you learn to just kind of time it by when the trains were going to come, because fortunately they're on pretty much of a schedule. But the fact that it has that and its proximity to a lot of things, and there's a lot of history in this town. And as you mentioned earlier, that little museum that we have is just such a blessing for this town, because it's keeping alive some of those history moments that we need to treasure, need to keep alive.
Well, when you look back at your time working those summers at the Glass House, what is something you want to make sure that we know from your experience?
First of all, I have a strong feeling about young people working. I know it helped build the kind of adult that I turned out to be. That and tremendous parental guidance. But a job of any kind, whether it's at the Glass House, I was just fortunate to be able to work at the Glass House. But it doesn't matter where you work, it's that feeling of doing something, getting paid for that, and feeling good about what you've done. I was really fortunate because my parents instilled in me a feeling of confidence if you had a savings account. So first summer I worked, they said, whatever you deposit in your bank will match. Well, my whole check went in the bank. Duh, I still got an allowance, so I didn't really, but they taught me that importance of saving. And in some ways, I think our world today has gotten away from that. We have been too quick to help people for too long without giving them that feeling of pride and self-worth of just doing a job. I don't care if it's pushing shopping carts or whether it's mopping a restroom floor or serving food. You feel good about a day's work. You feel a lot better than getting a check in the mail. And that tends to be cyclical. So if nothing else, I think I learned as a young person that you feel better about yourself if you've worked and earned a little bit of money, that you can then do what you want to with it. That was really important to me. And it was a continuation of what my parents had always taught me. They were not in that mindset of buying something on time. You saved up until you could buy it, and then you bought it. And our world has changed, but I still have that mindset. I still want to be able to pay for something when I get it, rather than let someone else, charge me a lot more for it. So that's what I got out of working at the Glass House. It happened to be at the Glass House. It would have been any place I would have worked. But that was the only job I had until I became a teacher. I didn't have any other part-time jobs. I didn't work in college. I only worked in the summers. So that was my platform for learning right there. And I was very fortunate to have Annabella at the head of it. And she jived with Mother and Dad's philosophy. So that just really impressed me.
What year did you retire from teaching?
I retired in 2003. The year Mama got sick, and we were able to spend a lot of time with her. Bob and I both retired in June. Our son got married, and then Mother became ill, and we spent every day over here with her. And so, it's a long time ago. And then after that, Bob was a country boy. He was raised in the country over near Bartlesville. And we bought 20 acres of Phil Phillips's old land. Phil was one of the old Phillips people, and he and Bob were great friends. He was a benefactor to the museum, and had a great friendship. So Bob wanted a little piece of his ranch. So we bought 20 acres with a big fishing pond and built a home. And Bob fishes every day in Phil's old pond and smiles when he catches a fish. Phil Phillips is a whole nother ball game. You should do a study on him. He was interesting. Great man.
And what are you doing these days in your spare time?
Oh gosh, well, Bob and I love antiques, and I do a lot of collecting. So I still do programs on, once a teacher, always a teacher. What is it my mother used to say? You can always tell a teacher, you just can't tell them much. I do a lot of collecting, and so I give informative programs about the history of different antiques that I collect. Mother was a quilter, so I collect old quilts. I like the history of fabrics, textiles. I like antique sewing tools. I do a big program on antique sewing tools. Of course, I love children. I'm still involved with children. I don't do vacation Bible school anymore. Once the kids grew out of that, I kind of dropped that. We travel to Colorado when we can. We like to go to Stillwater, visit OSU as often as we can, and just enjoy our days. Bob likes to plant trees, so Phil cleared the land and Bob's filling it back up.
Well, you mentioned when you were younger, Annabelle would be involved with 4-H activities with you. Did you ever make it to 4-H Roundup in Stillwater?
Every year. In fact, I was district secretary. I ended up very, very active in 4-H. Got lots of scholarships for college. It was a platform that I would wish upon every child if they have the opportunity to be in 4-H. Loved Roundup. Oh my goodness. Kansas City Royal. One quick short story. We always went to the state fair in Tulsa, and we had a big notebook that we kept of our things that we had done. And Mother was the 4-H coach, and she said, "You've got to choose something to judge." And I said, "Chickens." And she said, "Chickens? You don't know anything about chickens." And I said, "I'll go to a workshop." They had a workshop in Pryor. I went, wouldn't touch one. The first one I tried to pick up got away from me, and it got out loose. It was just very embarrassing. So we go to the Tulsa State Fair, and at that time we stayed like several days in a bunkhouse, and we did our judging. So I go to the poultry barn, and back in those days, before your time, there was a poultry barn and a pig barn, and so I went to the poultry barn, and here were all these farm kids. There were probably over 100 kids. We had our little notepad, our notes, and we were to judge these chickens. I swear, true story, I won grand champion judge. I didn't touch a chicken, I just guessed. Went down the whole list, won the whole Tulsa State Fair contest. So later that year, I won a trip to the Kansas City American Royal. We rode the train up, Mother and I went. In those days, we had dyed to match sweaters and skirts, and mine was blue, and I had the little pearl collar. Everyone had a pearl collar because you could wear it on different sweaters. Had this blue, had the 3 kick pleats in the back, which was a big deal. My blue, I walk into the hotel, and there's 3 guys up at the desk signing in that are also 4-H. And they say, "Oh, there's that champion chicken judger from Vinita, Oklahoma." And I just about died. I just fell over in embarrassment. That's all they remembered about me, was I was a champion chicken judger. And that was the last thing I knew about. So I had a little bit of a famous moment there. It was much more fun being Princess Vinita in the Tulsa Parade than it was to judge chickens at the state fair. But 4-H was a great platform. Great platform. I learned public speaking. I learned how to get in front of a crowd. I led the Pledge of Allegiance to the whole roundup at the stadium, and didn't bother me. 4-H was great.
Good
Were
memories.
you in 4-H ever?
I was not. I was
It was
not.
wonderful. It was wonderful. Mother was a coach, and we had something called Share the Fund Acts, and we would put together skits, and we won every time. Mother was a great putter together, or is that a word? Putter together. She would put together skits, and we always won. So 4-H was a great platform, and Annabelle was a good resource at the Public Service Building. She was always more than willing to share information about, because one of my demonstrations was with an electric skillet, preparing breakfast in an electric skillet in front of a whole panel of judges. Lots of public speaking, lots of talking and writing speeches. It was good.
What a great time, because you just saw this great shift in technology, and to have a resource like Annabelle who is right there with access to these tools.
And knew about it all.
Yeah.
And could talk to anybody. You know, she could go into anybody's kitchen and feel comfortable. So it was a neat memory. Certainly different than today.
Yes. Great memories. Cheryl, thank you so much for spending some time.
Well,
Is
you're
there
welcome.
anything else you'd like to add before we close out?
I think you've covered pretty much all of my memories. I had to really think back about those memories, because I often just cover the 5 years as my 5 summers at the Glass House, and I don't think about these specifics. So it was kind of fun with that little list that you sent of questions to really think again about it, because it was an important part of my history. It was an important part of my formation of, I hope, a successful adult. And I think we're missing the boat by not encouraging young people to work more.
Well,
I'm a strong believer.
we appreciate your time, and thank you once again.
Thank you.